Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them,
Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also.
But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the Northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure, so the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said,
Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve stood beside me and said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island.
On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight.
Good morning, New Heritage. One of the side benefits of meeting virtually is being able to pre-record the message. So even though Sherelle and I are enjoying some beach time with our family, we can still be with you to continue our discussion of Acts. This is my favorite chapter in Acts, due in no small part to it being the text from my favorite sermon from my favorite preacher when I heard David Fleer preach this chapter at Pepperdine in 2010. Some of the images in this sermon are inspired by his. Most of you know that Sherelle and I grew up in southern New Mexico, and even though the picture is too small for you to see the numbers, the orange color at 8 inches of rain per year should tell you that water was not something we were accustomed to having around. You could say that southern New Mexico has a beauty that you learn to appreciate, like when Sherelle tells people that I have a great personality. Where I grew up and how dry it is might explain why I am fascinated with water, especially the ocean, with the sheer beauty, power, and frankly insignificance you feel standing in front of it or floating on it. I don't think I'm alone. Ships, and more specifically shipwrecks, are embedded as part of our deeper collective consciousness. As Jennings says in his study of Acts, the sea both gives life and takes it. It is both friend and enemy and must be respected at all times. Take, for example, the Titanic. It's easy to recall the stubborn folly of men and how that folly cost 1,500 souls, sinking in the North Atlantic in 1912 after striking an iceberg on its maiden voyage. The Titanic story has almost an irresistible magnetism. When Sherelle and I got married in '98, we asked our DJ to play our first dance music, a sailing song titled Into the Mystic by Van Morrison. But as we started to shuffle around the dance floor, we realize that instead of playing our song, almost as if compelled, he was playing My Heart Will Go On, which was Celine Dion's smash hit from the movie Titanic. In 2010, I learned about another maritime event 104 years before Titanic, when in 1808, a 21-year-old college graduate from Scotland boarded a ship with his family called the Hibernia, bound for America. 8 days later, it struck a rock in a storm off the west coast of Scotland and sank. But in a stroke of providence, everyone on board was rescued. The young college graduate was named Alexander Campbell. And during this shipwreck, the experience of the shipwreck, he committed his life to ministry. He would go on to America and, together with another person named Barton Stone, start something called the Restoration Movement, which was the origins of the modern-day disciples and churches of Christ. Sometimes it isn't a storm or the elements that doom a ship, but bad leadership and decision-making. Willie Jennings brings up one such case. It was 30 years before the Hibernia sank off the coast of Scotland, when in 1781, just 5 years after the American Declaration of Independence, under calm seas and even calmer weather, the British ship named Zong sailed through the Caribbean, and when its captain, Luke Collingwood, fell gravely ill, got lost, and their crew realized they had 4 days' worth of water, with 10 days left before landing in Jamaica. There were 461 souls aboard the ship. These tales of vessels in peril with passengers and crew at the mercy of the hazardous seas are familiar to us and work deep in our consciousness. And even though it has been ages since we've heard a prayer with the once familiar plea for those on storm-tossed seas, and even though no one still sings the old classic, Master, the Tempest is Raging, and even though the origins of the great hymn, When Peace Like a River, where it was composed, and the tragedy that preceded its composition are now lost entirely on the newest generation of churchgoers, these tales of shipwreck still awaken and captivate us. And so it is with Luke when we read Acts 27. They let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. Could it be that shipwreck stories are so compelling because they remind us how easy they are to spot in everyday life? We've all known the relationship that seems so strong and is now capsized under the battering storm of the ups and downs of life, with wreckage strewn all over social media, attracting the electronic voyeurs and the virtual buzzards flocking to one side or the other to pick at the remains. Or maybe our church has foundered and now run aground, full of those people who either were unable to change or unwilling to cling to the unchangeable. And I'm not suggesting we embody Acts 23, where the religious people went out without food and water until someone murdered Paul, but we will definitely fast from church activities until those undesirables are no longer with us. Well, surely in 2020 we can spot the blame for the mess in the nation or world around us. It could be the wreck this global pandemic has caused, or maybe you feel it isn't this year, but rather the last 4 years that have been the disaster, or maybe it's not the last 4, but the 4 before that, or the 8 before that, or maybe you still hold a grudge against the Millard Fillmore administration and the mess he made of things. If the shipwrecks have been easy to spot, even dating back hundreds of years, after reading Acts 27, your initial reaction might be that our writer ran out of ideas, so he went with the crowd-pleasing song right before the finale. I like what David Fleer says about this notion. Luke wasn't the last, nor does he get the prize for the first tale in the shipwreck genre. However, Luke's not after original screenplay, but content and motive and reason, and the shipwreck in Acts is radically different in meaning from the tales we know so well. So as we dig into the text, the question we're asking is why? Maybe the why is to make a statement. Paul is under arrest following the recent trials with Felix, Festus, and Agrippa. He's handed over to a Roman centurion named Julius, and here's the first part of the text where something is unexpected. The centurion treats Paul with kindness. Maybe this was because the centurion could see Paul was no threat, but no matter the reason why, This treatment stands in sharp contrast with Paul's recent past involving stonings, beatings, and imprisonment. Luke indicates this kindness was the exception at that time in history, not the norm. He's allowed to connect with friends and have them care for him. He is spared the torment of isolation that damages the body and ruins the soul. We live in a country that has the highest incarceration rate in the world. I appreciated when Giovanni came and spoke to us about the work they're doing at Restoring Justice in Houston. Demonstrating loving kindness to those incarcerated is Spirit-led, holy work. Are we still asking why? Maybe we need to hear the voice of Paul, speaking before the seas get rough, before the waves and the hopelessness. Paul says that it was late in the season, and I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also. But unfortunately, Paul is bound on a ship full of Alexandrian grain, and since Rome desperately needed grain, all the ships were insured with financial guarantees in case they were lost or bounty paid upon successful delivery. Their response to Paul's warning is a typical response to prophetic word that interrupts profit management and strategic planning aimed at survival. The word of God rarely is able to penetrate those lost in these calculations. Because in this world, business profits trump human life, the captain and owner reject Paul's warning and sail into risk and danger. When I mentioned in the beginning about the British ship named Zong that ran out of water in the Caribbean before landing in Jamaica, I left out one detail. Out of 461 people on board, 442 were African slaves taken from Ghana, nearly twice the amount a ship of that size could safely transport. When the water supplies ran critically low with several days to go, the captain called a meeting and informed the crew that as long as the slaves were thrown overboard to save the rest of the cargo, they were insured by the owners of the ship. The crew unanimously agreed, and over the next 3 days, 142 Africans were thrown overboard, including 54 women and children. Insurance was collected back in England at £30 per person, which is about $6,000 in today's U.S. money. Nearly 1,700 years after our story in Acts, business profits still trump human life. In our story, once greed and poor judgment commit them to a course of action, the southern breeze shifts and the storm takes over. Jesus is not there to utter peace be still, and Paul does not pray to silence the wind or still the waves. Nature takes its course. While God sometimes works in quieter ways, in this instance, the storm intensifies. The music in our story switches dark and foreboding, threatening in a minor key. Winds turn to hurricane force. Cargo and tackle are cast over the rail. They cut the mainsail. The ship is out of control, off its course, out of their knowledge, driven where the fury of the violent seas will carry it. They sense land coming toward them and take soundings, 120 feet, now 90 feet, and they drop 4 anchors from the stern and pray for daylight. Now perched on the brink of disaster, fearing they will strike a sunken rock that will rip apart the ship, shatter the timbers, keel over the vessel, fill the hold with water, amid shrieks and moans and cries of terror. Still wondering why? It is at this moment, in the depths of despair from the crew, that we again hear the voice of Paul. Last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me." The writer of our story is not mailing it in with a catchy tune, and it does not take place at this time by accident. At the end of his second work, he connects this story to a story early on in his first work, his gospel. Just like Mary, Paul is assured by God's angel in this closing scene. As Mary said, "Let it be done to me according to your word," so Paul says, "I have faith in God that it will happen exactly as I've been told." Paul says, "From none of your head shall a hair be lost," recalling Jesus in the first work who said, "From none of your head shall a hair be lost." And in the next breath, Jesus says, "For you will gain possession of your lives by your endurance." This is why the shipwreck appears. It provides us this reality, this lesson. This is what we believe. This is who we are. This is our script today. If we are amid sunlight and seascape, winds that appear favorable, and this will remain our script when clouds darken the horizon and gather above us, and favorable winds turn to gale, when night follows day, summer turns to winter, and the storms of life are upon us. This shall be our script. This shall be our understanding. Don't be afraid. Profit should never trump human life. Remember whose you are and to whom you belong. God is in control. Take courage. And what a time to have this reminder. COVID-19, quarantine, lockdown, decisions regarding the economy, individual freedom, and the desire for normalcy weighed against human lives. Divorce rates up 34% year over year from March through June in the U.S. Protests, policing, racial equality, violence. Even the rosiest optimists might have to acknowledge the storm clouds in our world right now. David Fleer mentioned this when closing in 2010, but as I reread it this week, it could have been yesterday. There is a cultural war raging on the high seas, and we are being asked to enlist in its service. And so today I call us to remember whose we are, to whom we belong. And as Americans continue to gather evidence that only confirms their suppositions and filter out the evidence that challenges them, this country will continue to polarize and ghettoize. But we of all people who are Christians, we who have a theology to guide us, a different reality to shape us, and a spirit to follow, we of all people should know how to think and act in a storm. May we remember this as we are sent out into a world that God loves.